Hi, welcome to our next edition of STEMtalk. I'm Amanda McGee.
And I'm Whitney Dove. If you were with us last time, you know that we've been talking about some things that if we were to go back into the classroom, we might do a little bit different. If you weren't here with us last time, then welcome to Confessions of a Classroom Teacher.
So last time we talked about classroom environment and things we would do different in our classroom. Today we're going to look into matters more related to curriculum, and we're going to talk about the mistakes that we've made kind of with content planning as we were planning for curriculum and instruction for our students.
Yeah, absolutely. As we both evolved through our careers, we began to realize that there were several things, probably more than several, that we would do differently if we were to go back, and we know that that would really impact our teaching, and we hope it does yours too.
Absolutely. So we're going to start off with a topic that we know we were guilty of, and we're pretty sure everybody out there was guilty of it as well. And that is not leaning on our learning standards enough and not really making sure that our instruction was aligned to those standards.
Yes. But before we go on, let's take a minute and define what we mean when we say learning standards. So learning standards are a set of goals for what students should know and be able to do in each content area or at each grade level. Standards are important because they help teachers know that their students have the skills and knowledge they need to be successful on state assessments and in the future. They also allow parents to understand what is going to be expected of their children, and they ensure that each student receives equitable exposure to content by making sure that the content each year is related but not repeated.
So did you know that my first year of teaching, we didn't use learning standards pretty much at all?
No, I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised because guess what? I'm pretty sure I did the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it was a lot different back then, but we totally had a set of standards. They were the 1998 TEKS that had come out, but we just did not, we didn't teach them. So what kind of things did you do that were totally off standard?
Yeah, okay, so my first year of teaching, I taught 8th grade science. I had like 4 sections, I think, of on-level science, and then I had a few sections also of GT science, and I had this genius idea. Of course, I was fresh out of college, and I had all these wonderful experiences in my college courses, and I wanted to share that with my students. So I thought it would be really fun to have them do a leaf collection project.
Oh, Lord.
So I have a few here. I brought them. And just as an aside, these have been in my house now since 2007.
So they have made multiple moves with you.
They've moved with me. Important. I just can't bring myself to throw them away because I love them that much. So here, for example, this is what I believe is a weeping willow from the beautiful county of Grayson County, Texas, and a few more. Texas redbud. I mean, every kid needs to know how to be able to identify a redbud.
Were they just finding leaves? Like, what were they doing?
Oh, no. See,
for the project?
I gave them a list. I gave them a long list, actually, and they had to find, there were some required species that I knew for sure they would be able to find just by walking around in their neighborhoods. So they had to find 8 of the required species, and then they had to find 7 more that they just liked. And they used a field guide. I had ordered a bunch of field guides, and they used those to be able to identify the tree species. And then it was important to me also that they know how to mount them on the page. So they had a leaf press, and we bought all these big, actually we used our textbooks for our leaf press, and we just stacked those puppies up into the books, and then we sat on them and stuff for a few weeks. And then, they made these lovely books.
So, over the years, I have become pretty much of a TEK expert, and I can pretty much tell you for sure that there is no TEK that has anything to do with that in 8th grade science.
Yes, I think you might be right about that. These were definitely 8th graders, and looking back and knowing what I know now, definitely not an 8th grade standard. However, I've done some research, and I have justified this to myself just a little bit. There was actually a biology TEK that had these in it, and the biology standard said the student knows applications of taxonomy and can identify its limitations. The student is expected to collect and classify organisms at several taxonomic levels, such as species, phylum, and kingdoms, using dichotomous keys. So yes, I was perfectly well aligned to the biology standard.
Which you weren't teaching at the time.
Correct.
So there really wasn't anything wrong with the project. Actually, great project, perfectly aligned to that standard. It was just off grade level. So that's one of the fixes that we'll talk about as far as, you know, some of these things we love to hold on to is sometimes that they are aligned, just not where you are at. So this would have been a great thing for you to share with biology teachers in your district. You could have even, you know, volunteered to give them that lesson and those samples so that they could use it and benefit from that.
Yeah, I think so. I think it would have been really easy to just send an email to, you know, the department head over at the high school and say, hey, I came up with this idea. Do you mind if I do it? Is it going to interfere with anything you do? And then I still could have worked it in maybe even after the students had taken their standardized tests at the end of the year as a way to get them ready for biology. But I should not have taken up good class time. That I should have been teaching my standards by doing this project.
And that communication that you were just talking about with the high school would have been great because since this is their standard, there's not that many ways you can, you know, collect and organize organisms. So I'm pretty sure they would have done something very similar to this. And I bet they were pretty ticked off when the kids said, oh, we already did this. Miss Duff made us collect these leaves. We've already done that.
Yeah. Okay, so what kind of crazy stuff did you do?
Okay, so my first year teaching, again, I've already totally confessed that we did not use the standards at all. But we spent time, like a lot of time, like 6 weeks worth of time going through every phylum of animals or phyla of animals. We started, you know, we went through echinoderms, mollusks, all kinds of stuff. Kids loved it. We dissected as much as we could within those phylums. It was awesome. It was amazing.
And that was 7th grade science.
Oh, that was 7th grade science.
Okay, and did you have a learning standard
Absolutely
there?
Not. No way. Their classification wasn't even in there. I mean, I don't really know how we could even justify it other than the fact that it was awesome and the kids loved it and we loved doing it.
Okay, so, let's think about this. Is there a way we could have still done dissections, which we know the kids love, but also have tied it to the learning standard?
Yes, we actually have examples of that. We have the where we kind of just dissected for fun for the phylum of animals. And then we actually have how we changed it. So we did have teaks that dealt with structure and function and that dealt with how organisms were adapted for their ecosystems. So we were able to keep pretty much all of the dissections we did, but put them into the realm of the standard we were actually supposed to be teaching.
That makes sense. So it sounds like even considering our love lessons, these things that we just love to teach because they excite us and we hope they'll excite our students too, it sounds like there may be ways to keep them if you modify them somewhat or you just, you know, do a better job of making sure that you're hitting the learning standards rather than just doing it because you like to do it.
Right, absolutely. And I think that love lessons are really important because whenever you have something that you're passionate about, it totally, completely goes to the kids. The kids sense it, they feel it, and they love to do it too. So I do think it's still important to do those things that we like if they align or if we tweak them to make them fit. Just don't go crazy and spend weeks on something that doesn't align, but use it as a hook. Use it as an extension to get that in there for your kids because it is important to do those things that you are passionate about and you love to do.
Absolutely. But you know what this kind of reminds me of a little bit?
Our other big mistake?
Our other huge mistake.
What was that? Dinosaur project.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. We have our friend here with us. He came all the way from our old school that we used to teach at with us. We brought him here today so we could talk about this particular project.
So whenever I came back to the middle school that I used to teach at where we weren't as focused on learning standards, we didn't have a test for science yet. There really wasn't any accountability for us to be focused on them. When I came back, we did have TACs. We had started being tested on those teaks. So pretty much the days of doing kind of what we wanted were gone. So we had to start teaching those teaks. But I did ask each one of my departments, this is when I was the instructional coach, kind of what lessons they didn't want to get rid of, you know, what were those lessons they wanted to hold on to. For 7th grade, it was the dissections we've just talked about and we talked about how we made those fit. But for 8th grade, it was the dinosaur.
Yes, and I actually joined the team a couple of years later. And by the time I got there, they had already tweaked it a little bit and made it a little bit stronger. And then when I got there, I was having a really hard time understanding why we were doing this. So we worked extra hard to improve it. And we actually have examples for you on what we did to make it less about, oh, just make a dinosaur. And we made the kids think about biomes in particular and how different adaptations are well suited to certain biomes. And then we said, okay, make a list of adaptations that make dinosaurs successful in their ecosystem. Then choose the characteristics that you want to include in your own megasaur. So they did a lot of research on biomes, they thought a lot about adaptations, and then they created a dinosaur using just those adaptations. So we got a lot closer to hitting a standard about adaptations in different ecosystems. And the kids, they did have a great time. They loved this project. They looked forward to it every single year. So we hated to take it away from them, but we did make it a little bit more tightly aligned to the learning standards.
So we've been talking mainly about teaching things that are pretty much not aligned to standards at all and how you can tweak them to make them fit. But there's another mistake that we sometimes make, which is taking something aligned to standards and just going too far with it or spending too much time on it. Do you have an example of any time you ever did that?
Yes, I actually do have the perfect learning standard to talk about taking things just a bit too far. So when I taught 8th grade also, I had this standard. The student knows that traits of species can change through generations and that the instructions for traits are contained in the genetic material of the organisms. The student is expected to make predictions about possible outcomes of various genetic combinations of inherited characteristics. And I had the best time teaching this. I would teach an entire semester on this if they would let me. So I actually, remember I said I had just graduated from college, and I took a class called Religion in the 1920s. And in that class, I learned about the eugenics movement in the early 1920s and how America reacted to this whole eugenics movement. And they had these fit family contests where they would literally parade people around and they would say, look how beautiful this family is. And they would say, these people can go have lots and lots of babies because we want more of this genetics in the society. And so they would choose people. And I have a couple pictures that will show you of a family that had been selected to be one of these fit families. And we just went into great detail. We spent so much time talking about eugenics. We talked about the Holocaust and the pseudoscience in the Holocaust and all the twin studies and, you know, just like amazing, amazing things that happened deep in our country's history that I felt like the kids should know about.
So you did kind of like you're doing now? Went a little off topic for a little too long.
Okay, yeah, maybe so, sure.
But it is a really cool thing, and it is related to that standard, something that kids could know about, but it probably shouldn't have, you know, taken that much time of your classroom for it. So what could you have done?
Well, I think what we would have done differently, because it actually talks more about predicting the outcomes of various genetic combinations. I should have spent more time with Punnett squares and phenotype, genotype, and all of that stuff. I should have spent the majority of my time there. But what I think would have been really cool to do with this as a way to excite students and engage them is to do like a philosophical chairs or a Socratic circle. Just have a discussion surrounding this where the students could spend a night. This could be something they could do at home, reading a short article on eugenics, and they could come to the table with ideas and reactions, and we could still talk about it, but we couldn't spend 2 weeks on it.
Right, absolutely, because that's those things, especially these things that are related to real life and how this science applies to real life, is such an important way to either engage kids or extend what you did in class. Great idea for homework, actually making a homework be meaningful and something they could do at home that they're actually interested in.
Right, and then, you know, coming to class prepared with their own reactions to what they read about, and then maybe if we have time, connect that to some of the stuff that's going on in modern genetics. But again, I would not be able to spend that lengthy amount of time on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing I've been thinking about is that sometimes we do take the standard and go too far, but then there are also other times where we don't go far enough. So we take a standard and we do some of the cool stuff that, you know, might be a little bit below the standard, but it's so much fun.
Yeah. So, okay, what about you? Do you have an example?
Absolutely. So in 7th grade, there is a TEK about weathering, erosion, and deposition, that the student knows that natural events and human activity can alter Earth systems. The student is expected to analyze effects of regional erosion, deposition, and weathering. So I don't think we ever got there.
So what did you do?
We did all kinds of cool stuff. We did putting ketchup on pennies to show chemical weathering. We had different kinds of rocks in plastic bottles that they shook and looked at what happened to the rocks over time. I mean, we did all kinds of stuff. But it was always just about weathering, erosion, and deposition, not the standard, which was analyzing the effects of that on things in their environment or their region. We never got there.
So I definitely see what you mean about it being too low level. I think it would be fun.
And it was awesome.
I'm sure the kids had a great time with
those water bottles made so much noise.
all that gross stuff with the ketchup and stuff.
They loved it.
So what do you think you should do differently then?
Well, I think we probably could have spent a day on just that stuff. I mean, you can always still do it. If it's fun and it engages the kids, it's worth doing. And so they had this in 5th grade. They'd had it before, pretty much in detail. So doing some sort of pre-assessment to figure out what they had, we could have even kept the activities in there and done it from a mindset of, this is a hook, what have you learned, remember this stuff, but then spend the bulk of our time actually on the standard itself, which we did get better at doing over time. But that first year, we just had fun.
Yeah, and I can see if they had spent more of their time on the actual standard, that would even help them to be more prepared for their assessments.
Absolutely.
Instead of wasting time on stuff that you think they might already know.
So you know what this reminds me of? Remember when y'all were doing Coursera and you made those videos and y'all came up with Brace?
Yes.
This is totally what this reminds me of.
I love those videos. So we were actually working on some professional development courses that we did online, and we came to realize that taking a standard apart and then aligning lessons to that was something that was a little bit hard and ambiguous for teachers. It wasn't the way they normally did things. So we came up with these videos and would love to share them with you. So we're going to watch part 1 now.
Hi y'all, I'm so glad that you're here to join me today to have a conversation about aligning lessons to standards. I know that you all brought lessons today that are aligned to this standard: collect and analyze data to identify sequences and predict patterns in the observable appearance of the moon over time. Wow, I can't wait to see the lessons you brought. Mr. Kashonska, do you want to start?
All right, I'll go first. What I usually do for moon phases is I have the kids read the appropriate section of the textbook, and the teacher's guide comes with a worksheet, so I have them do the worksheet as well.
Thank you, Mr. Kashonska. Miss Amador?
I do a moon cookie activity every year. My kids really love it. What they do is they open up a cookie, they get to cut off pieces of the icing, they put the phases of the moon in order, they write the moon phases on it, then they get to eat the cookies, which they really love. My principal really likes this activity too. He always gives me the highest marks when he comes in for my evaluation.
Okay, who's next?
This is the first year I've had to teach moon phases, so I didn't really know what to do. So I went online and I found this great website where you type in your birthday and it will tell you what the phase of the moon was on the day that you were born. So I had the kids make these models, and they each got to create one that was the shape of the moon on their birthday, and then they added the little tag with their birth date, and we hung these up around the room. We had lots of different moon phases and lots of different dates.
Thank you, Miss Bing. Miss Verlassen, you're next.
My lesson's really fun and engaging too. The kids really love it. What I do is I get a golf ball and I paint it half black and put it in the middle of their table, and they work in groups of 4. And what they do is the kids have to draw a picture of the moon that they see where they are on the table. And then when they open it up, you can see that by looking at the phase of the moon, they have to draw where the Earth, the moon, and the sun are in relationship to each other. And they do that for every phase of the moon or every position on the table. What I love about this lesson, it gets them up and moving around, and the kids all really enjoy it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I have an assessment I'd like you to take back to your kids. It's aligned to the standard, so give it to them and see how they do, and then just be prepared to discuss it later.
that's such a great video. And I love that it pretty much shows that y'all all had completely different lessons to teach that standard.
Yeah. Do you think any of us actually hit the standard?
Not really. Not really. So what should teachers do then? That was a typical, I think, planning session that you see lots of teachers get into, where they get together as a group, they pull all those lessons that they found from different places, and they just pick which ones were their favorite, and they use them.
Yeah. Well, I think our conversation here has started off in exactly the right way. We started our conversation with the learning standards, which is exactly what we would want teachers to do too. We would want them to take those learning standards and break them down so that you absolutely understand how it could be interpreted in terms of what the kid has to do to show that they know that standard. So let's watch a little bit more now.
Welcome back, everyone. Earlier, you shared with me some lessons that you felt were aligned to this standard. Collect and analyze data to identify sequences and predict patterns in the observable appearance of the moon over time. I shared with you an assessment question that's also aligned to this standard. I'm dying to hear how your kids did with it. So, Mr. Kashanska?
Yeah, actually, my kids did not do very well on this particular test item, which I don't understand. The text is very clear. The kids totally understood the names of the phases and what causes the moon to change. But when it came to this item, they didn't do very well.
You know, as clear as the text may be, I think we might be facing the problem of alignment here. And that can be a problem when we use outside resources. They aren't always aligned to the exact standard that we're trying to have a lesson be aligned to. So, for instance, in your text, it talked about why the moon appears to change. And in the standard, I'm not seeing where it's asking kids to know that information. Also, in the standard, it is asking kids to collect and analyze data, identify sequences, and predict patterns based on their own observations, and I'm not seeing where the text had them do that.
I see what you mean.
Okay, Miss Amador, how did your kids do on the question?
Well, I don't get it. My students didn't do very well either. They loved the lesson. They loved eating the cookies. My principal loved the lesson. Every time I showed a picture of a moon phase on the board, they were able to tell me which one it was. But when they got the test, they seemed frustrated and did not get the right answer.
You know, Miss Amador, one surefire way to keep your kids engaged is to let them use food in a lesson, so by that token, I'm sure that they loved it. The problem that I see is, again, alignment to standard. So I didn't see in your lesson where kids were collecting and analyzing data, or identifying sequences, or predicting patterns. Sometimes we hold on to lessons because we love them so much, but as you saw for yourself, they didn't quite master the standard.
Wow, I never thought about it that way.
Okay, Miss Bing, you're up.
Yeah, my kids didn't do so well either, and it's really frustrating to me because this lesson incorporated technology, and we were able to draw a connection to their real lives. They got to look up their own birthdays, but on this test item, my kids, they just did not understand. They did not do well.
Well, the good news is that your kids will never forget what moon phase it was on their birthday. The bad news is that I'm not sure they mastered the standard. I'm still not seeing where these key actions that they needed to do were in the lesson. The problem with doing a keyword search is often that any lesson can pop up, which doesn't guarantee that it's aligned to the standard. So we have to be really careful when we're writing lessons that they are actually aligned to the standard before we give them to kids.
Yeah, I get it. An internet search can pull up all kinds of things that are only barely related.
All right. Ms. Verlassen, how did your kids do with the golf ball activity?
Yeah, my kids didn't do very well either on the test. I'm starting to have some suspicions as to why that might have happened. I came up with the lesson based on what the department chair told me the standard was supposed to be about, which was they had to learn the phases of the moon and the relative position of the Earth, Moon, and Sun at each phase of the moon. But I'm starting to think after taking this test that that wasn't what they were supposed to be learning.
You've learned something very valuable, Ms. Verlassen. Your lesson was actually perfectly aligned to the interpretation of the standard that your department chair had, just unfortunately not aligned to the actual standard. What we know from this is we have to interpret our own standards. Luckily, I have a tool to help you with that, though.
Okay, so all of those lessons were misaligned, but for totally different reasons. They all did not match for a different reason, each one of them. One teacher heavily relied on outdated textbook. Another one just pulled something off the internet. And then that department chair, she was just totally doing what she loved to do.
Yeah. So all of us in the video had really great intentions, but none of us quite got there. And you'll notice that, you know, the things we've talked about so far were all represented in that group. The love lesson and just relying on the textbook and not really thinking about your learning standards. So we all came to the table with something we were proud of, but something that didn't quite do what it needed to do. So let's watch the next part now.
The tool that I have for you to help with aligning lessons to learning standards is called the brace. Okay, so let's start with the BR for breakdown, because we're going to break down the standard into its parts so we know how to write a lesson that's aligned to it. So we're looking for 3 parts to the standard: the verbs, the objects, and the qualifying information. The first verb that I see up here is collect. Do you see any other verbs, Miss Amador?
Yes, I also see analyze.
That's perfectly right, Miss Amador. So students are expected to both collect and analyze on their assessments and their learning experiences.
And there's identify.
And the verb predict.
Right you are. The next step is to identify the objects of these verbs. So what is the object of collect and analyze?
Data.
Very good.
And for identify, the object is sequences.
And for predict, the object's patterns.
Okay, so I'm going to point out one very interesting thing in this standard. Notice that the 2 connects collect and analyze data with identify sequences and predict patterns. What do you make of that?
Well, maybe it means that our breakdowns will have 2 verbs and 2 objects?
That's exactly right. So the first breakdown of this standard would start out with collect data to identify sequences.
I think I see where you're going with this. How about analyze data to identify sequences?
Great, y'all. So now we need to look for any qualifiers. What is the verbiage here that narrows the scope of the standard?
Well, I think it's important that it says in the observable appearance of the moon over time.
Very good. So the next thing we need to do is construct a list of all of the objects with their verbs and their qualifiers so that we have an inventory of all the possible student outcomes inherent in the standard. Let me do the first one for you. Collect data to identify sequences in the observable appearance of the moon over time.
And the next one would be analyze data to identify sequences in the observable appearance of the moon over time.
Okay, I think I see what you're doing. We can figure out the rest.
Sure, go ahead.
So for any learning standard, you can do the breakdown process. Sometimes it's a little bit more challenging than others, but for the most part, you're just going to look for the verbs and then the information that they attach to that verbs and make a list of as many of them as there are in that standard, and that gives you a clearer picture of how the student might be tested.
Oh yeah, if I had known this kind of stuff my first couple years of teaching, things would have been so much different. I mean, we don't ever as teachers do anything with ill intent, I don't think. I don't think we ever plan a lesson. We spend so much time doing it that we plan a lesson for it not to be aligned. I always think that we have the good intentions to make it align and make it great for our kids. But if I would have had a process that helped me figure out exactly how to do that, things would have been so much easier.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll say too that even into my later years of teaching, when we knew we had to use the learning standards, we didn't always dive deep into the learning standards.
Absolutely.
We just accepted them for face value and really did not try to draw that tight connection.
Oh, me too. And I think that it was when I was up at the district level that we really started looking at verbs. We'd still look at it as content. Oh, we're teaching weather and erosion and deposition. We would still look at that content word. And then I also had a teacher one time, and it was a light bulb moment for me, that when we would read those standards as teachers, we often read them as things like what we should be doing. So I should be analyzing the effects, or I should be helping my kids do this. And I had a teacher one time look at me and go, oh my God, these are the students. Like, the kids should be doing this. And I think that, once we think about that, it really helps us, kind of change those classroom experiences for them.
Yeah, it frames it differently. So, okay, let's wrap this video up. Let's watch part 4 and see what happens.
Okay, so here's what we have. Collect data to identify sequences in the observable appearance of the moon over time. Analyze data to identify sequences in the observable appearance of the moon over time. Collect data to predict patterns in the observable appearance of the moon over time. And analyze data to predict patterns in the observable appearance of the moon over time.
Very good, guys. Okay. So next, the most important thing for us to talk about are the boundary statements, or in other words, what we're not going to talk about from the standard. What does the standard not say that we should be teaching kids? So nowhere in the standard does it talk about having the kids memorize the names of the moon phases.
Wait, so if we don't use the names of the phases, how do we talk about them?
I'm not saying you can't use the names of the moon phases. Certainly you should use all of the correct terms. And maybe some of the kids will even master the use of these terms by the end of the lesson. But my point is, this is not one of our learning goals for the lesson. So now what I'd like you to do is to generate a list of all the boundary statements for this standard.
We also think it's outside of the standard that the students have to know the moon phases based on the positions of the Earth, Moon, and Sun.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about that one. How can kids predict the pattern if they don't know what causes the moon phases?
Well, humans throughout history have been making very accurate predictions about changes to the moon without knowing anything about the alignment of the sun, earth, and moon. So I definitely think that that should be a boundary statement for this standard. One important thing for us to consider are the misconceptions that your students will have surrounding the learning standard. We have to be sure to address those. So, what are some common misconceptions your students might have about this learning standard?
Well, many students think that the moon goes away during the day, and I want them to have a lot of experiences of looking at the moon at different times so they can see that.
I also have students who think that the moon is actually changing shapes during the lunar cycle.
Excellent ideas. So outlining all of this information is going to help you greatly in designing your assessment and your learning experience. In our BRACE protocol, the next step is to design the assessment. You will want to think about the observable student behaviors that demonstrate mastery of the learning standard. In other words, for each of the student outcomes, what evidence could the student produce to prove that they had mastered this outcome? Be thinking about this because I'm going to turn you guys loose in a few minutes to develop your own assessments. The CE in our protocol stands for Classroom Experience, which is the last step. This is where you design a series of classroom experiences that provide your students with the opportunity to develop the skills and knowledge that they need to successfully master the assessment. Okay, so here's the part where you get to design an assessment and a learning experience aligned to the standard. I can't wait to see what y'all come up with. All right, guys, here's our standard one more time. Collect and analyze data to identify sequences and predict patterns in the observable appearance of the moon over time. I can't wait to see what you have for me.
We're excited too. This process has been really helpful.
I'm very glad to hear that. Let's see your work.
Okay, so for our assessment, we knew that we would want the students to use data to predict something in the future. So what we did is we made up some moon phases for some moon other than our own. We'll have the students observe what's happening here and analyze the data so that they can notice any patterns, and hopefully they would be able to tell us what the moon might have looked like on some other day. Perhaps, what does the moon look like on day 0? Or what would the moon have looked like on day 5?
Oh, wow. I love that in your assessments, the students are using data to identify sequences and predict patterns. That's perfectly aligned to the standard. So what are they going to do in class?
So what we were looking for is a learning experience that was going to prepare the kids for the assessment. So what we're going to have them do is keep a moon journal for 1 month. Every day for a month, they're going to draw what the moon looks like, take notes, bring those to class, and then they'll use them to see patterns and make predictions about future moon phases.
I think you guys have really got it. Your assessment and your learning experience are perfectly aligned to the standard, and I know that your students are going to demonstrate mastery on the assessment. Great work.
See, that's so cool. Just by looking at that standard, you were able to plan your assessments and then be able to plan those classroom experiences for the kids to have.
Yes, and if I had known this as a classroom teacher and as an instructional coach, it would have made things so much easier for me.
Yep, that really does make me think about how important it is to plan with the end goal in mind. That's something that I didn't understand as a classroom teacher either, as how important that was.
Yeah, I mean, I remember most of my years teaching that the test was something I paid very little attention to. You know, we would just kind of like throw a few questions together that we liked, or we would use test generator software and may or may not have been doing a good job of actually telling me what the students knew.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I didn't really think that I cared if they were connected to what they did in the classroom. So like I would make, we made our test, but I don't really think I put a lot of thought into, it was just, again, whatever that standard was on, whether it be cells, I'd write a bunch of questions about cells, but I don't think I really thought about what they were doing in the classroom or what they needed to do to be able to answer those questions.
Yeah, I think it's probably true for both of us that we may have started with a general overview of the standards, like you said, to get a topic in mind. Weathering and erosion. Okay, sure, we're teaching weathering and erosion. And then we planned all these cool activities.
Yep.
And then, the day before the test, we just threw a bunch of questions together. Maybe we used the test from last year, and we did not spend time really crafting an authentic assessment. I should have done differently. I really should have worked on that while I still had the chance.
Absolutely. So I think we both agree that having that assessment done before you start designing your lessons is actually a really beneficial thing.
Mm-hmm.
It helps you know exactly where the kids should be and what you need to be able to do for them to get them there. So that does remind me of whenever we had time, when I got to the district level, one of the things I was in charge of is being able to write curriculum that would help teachers, because let's not joke into saying that teachers have plenty of time just sitting around to do this kind of stuff. So I wanted to try to help out as much as I could, and if I could break down some of those standards and do that for them, do that legwork so that they could just go to that to reference as they were planning, I thought that was important. So let's look at some of those documents that we worked on together while we were there.
Yeah, the curriculum maps.
So you can see from this curriculum map that we're able to look at the student expectation right up there at the front, and then what your desired outcomes are, what those goals are. They're right up there, front and center. That's the most important thing. It's not until the last part of the curriculum documents where you actually plan the learning plan, you actually look at what that learning should look like. And we will say these were created from backwards design, understanding by design. That's how we kind of modeled these.
Right. And I think one thing that's interesting too, I'll point out, is that part of the curriculum document, the standard and then the expected student outcomes, that absolutely does not change from year to year until your standards change. When your standards change, then you have to repeat that process. But that part, if you'll do it once, then it's done.
Yeah.
And then you can tweak your assessments from year to year and redesign your classroom learning experiences as the data suggests that you should. One thing that we also did on our curriculum documents is we went ahead and looked for release test items. Yes. What does the state say that an assessment of this standard looks like? And we use that wherever possible.
So let's look at an example of an assessment question.
Okay.
So here we have an example of a question about photosynthesis. If you knew this question was going to be on your test, what would you want to try to make sure to write into the lesson plans?
Okay, sure. So before we do that, I want to look at the standard that this question says that it is aligned to. So the standard that this question says it's aligned to this came from high school NGSS. The process of photosynthesis converts light energy to stored chemical energy by converting carbon dioxide and water into sugars plus released oxygen. So I would have to say right off the bat that this question is perfectly well aligned to that particular standard. So if I wrote this question or I chose it from a test bank, I would want to make sure that my students actually had this experience, that they were using test tubes, and that they saw that if a plant was in the test tube, it was releasing oxygen. And you would have to use an indicator or let them use a little microscope or hand lens to look and see if you can see the bubbles. But it tells me that my students need to observe oxygen being created in that test tube. And I will say, just by the way, that I did write that question.
I know, and you're very proud of that question.
And I love that question very much.
So what we did was really pretty cool just now, is that we took a question, we looked at that assessment, made sure that assessment question was aligned to the standard, and then we were able to say that those kids should have been able to have an experience where they were able to see this actually happening. You don't want to surprise them by seeing something totally different on a test and they've never been exposed to in class. Making sure that rigor lines up is super important.
Right, and we just did one simple part of it. It would of course be a little bit more detailed, but I think the important thing is that we now have a really good understanding of the entire process. We're not looking at it as segmented, classroom instruction and assessments. We're looking at it as a big puzzle that's fitting together. So one thing that I ask my teachers to do, speaking of assessments, is that I had them prepare their tests several weeks in advance, and they had to submit their test to me. And then I ran an analysis on it. I looked at the breakdowns, and I did that for them because it is a little bit challenging, but I went ahead and broke the standard out, and I looked at each individual question, and I would make a decision about whether or not it was aligned to the breakout. If it was aligned, then I said, cool, go on. And if it wasn't aligned, I might have provided some feedback and said, let's talk about this. What is this going to look like in the classroom, or how does this change classroom instruction if you have to ask that question? And so we had some really fruitful conversations there. And I think, it does take some time getting used to that process, but it improves your assessments overall.
And absolutely, and like you said before, is that these desired results, these assessments, these standards, they don't change unless your standards have changed. So when you do this front end of the work and you design a really good assessment, you can pull it out the next year, make minor changes because kids are always different. Kids are they come to you from different places, so you want to make minor adjustments for that. But in general, if you've got a really good aligned test, then you can kind of just take it from year to year, and you don't have to start from scratch every year. You can take that and make those improvements, make it better, make it more aligned. We can always be more aligned, and then you move on.
Yeah, I think the really hard thing that came out of this process was that teachers then had to question their learning experiences that they had planned, and if a teacher's been doing a certain lab for 20 years and all of a sudden they're realizing for the first time that lab may not be aligned to the standard, that was a very hard conversation to have. and scary.
Yes.
You know, because if I have to take that out, then what am I putting in? And where does that come from? And what does that look like? And how do my students act? And all of that. So a lot of unknowns.
But then that kind of goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, is if you find that where it's not totally aligned, is what can you do? Can you make a minor tweak to make it aligned? Should it be something that is it aligned to another grade level? Can you share that experience with a different teacher at a different grade level so that you still get, you know that kids are benefiting from that really good classroom experience? Because it probably was, it just wasn't the right one for that time and place.
Absolutely. So we kind of did things backwards.
Absolutely.
In a way. This is a little bit different. But, it also helps us from making another huge mistake.
And what is that?
Well, how many times have you seen, I know I've seen this a million times, but how many times have you seen an assessment that is way more rigorous than the classroom instruction was?
Oh, all the time. All the time. And I think there were even times that I was guilty of knowing I was doing that. Like knowing that, oh my God, I'm gonna make this really hard. Like I've got like these couple questions, and I tend to love the really hard questions, especially if I made them up. Like, oh, this is amazing. I'm gonna make this really hard to see what they know. So, but I totally would not have gotten them ready for that in the classroom.
Right.
And we didn't do anything to get ready for it.
Not even fair. If you think about
it's
it.
so not fair.
It's not fair.
So not fair.
Yeah.
So I think one thing, when we talk about this, it reminds me of Bloom's. So we're going to show you a Bloom's taxonomy, kind of pyramid, a chart. And some people talk about Bloom's. You now also have depth of knowledge, DOK, Costa's levels of questioning. There's all different ways to talk about that, but it's pretty much just a hierarchy of complexity and rigor. Now, that's not one of my favorite words, but a hierarchy to kind of show you of how things move up, how things scaffold over time. And it is really important that you look at the Bloom's level or DOK level, whatever you want to use, of your standard, and also of what you're having those kids do in the classroom. If you've got a question asking those kids to evaluate, and all you're doing in the classroom is having them, understand and remember, then they're not gonna get there, or it's gonna be a lot harder for them to get there. And then in turn, you as a teacher tend to get frustrated, and nobody wants that. Yeah. Nobody wants to feel that way.
I think it's important to point out too that a lot of standards, unfortunately, are very low level. We have a lot of remember standards, and we sometimes get swept up in this idea of more rigor, more rigor, more rigor, but if a kid is never going to be assessed beyond the remember level, then we should not assess them beyond the remember level. Now, is there a way to, expose them to more high-level thinking and questioning? Absolutely, but it just should not be on your summative exam, because your summative needs to tell you, does the kid know the standard?
They need to know. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I want to look at another question for a good example of this. So we have another question that comes from our high school NGSS. So in this question, we have kids actually thinking about what data they would need to collect to be able to evaluate a claim about diversity in ecosystems. So if that's what we want them to be able to do on a summative exam, what kind of classroom experience should they have?
Well, they need to do exactly that. They need to be able to collect all kinds of data and discuss what the data tells them.
Very
and
true.
Then when they have those conversations in their groups or in the larger class, then they can talk about which data works, which data doesn't work, does the data support a claim, and they can draw a connection between the types of data and then the types of claim that data will support or not support.
Totally, and because they've done that, they would be able to have the information they need to be able to answer the question. I do think it's important to say that we're not saying do everything that the question tells them to do, because I think that's one of the biggest, at a district level when I was writing curriculum benchmark assessments, the biggest complaint that I would get that sometimes would drive me a little crazy is that teachers would tell me, well, that's not how I did it in the classroom, or that's not the example I used in the classroom. So we're not saying to do exactly what the assessment question says, but what we're saying is to make sure you've given them the experiences they have to be able to relate that to another example. So if we're talking about ecosystems here, maybe you do it with a different ecosystem than what you're going to use on the test, because you do want kids to be able to transfer knowledge. That's pretty much the ultimate goal, is that they can take what they've learned in one area and move it somewhere else.
And I don't want to open a whole different can of worms here, but I feel like this is a really good time to say, we hear a lot in the education world and then outside of the education world too, that all teachers do these days is teach to the test,
yep.
teach to the test, teach to the test. And what we're going to posit here is that maybe teaching to the test is not such a bad idea if the test is aligned to the learning standards. So a good friend of ours always says, if I'm in culinary school and I'm going to be assessed on baking a pie, then should my teacher teach me to the test? Absolutely, he should teach me to the test. Driver's ed works the same way. If I'm in driver's ed, should my teacher be teaching me to the test? I think we all agree that in that case, yes, you have to teach to the test. So there's a couple of different things going on here. One is making sure you understand your standards, and the other is take time on that assessment.
Right.
Make sure that assessment piece does what it's supposed to do by building it first. Put the thought into that assessment, and then design your learning to meet those needs.
Absolutely. And I'll go on one of my little soapboxes here for a little bit, is the fact that it's okay as teachers for us not to agree with some of the stuff that's going on in education right now. 100% okay. If you're not, the standards that you're having to teach, if that's not what, you feel is right for you to do, the way that we're testing kids, it's okay for you to disagree with it. But what's not okay is for you to use the kids to help you fight it. I've had lots of teachers tell me stuff like, well, I'm just not going to teach that because I don't think that's important and it shouldn't be important. But then you're hurting the kids. This is the game they have to play, whether we like it or not. So I don't feel like we should fight that battle in the classroom. But by all means, do what you need to do. Email your senators, email your congressmen, email, anybody that you know. Go out and, protest. Do what you need to do to get those changes made. But just don't do it in a way that's going to hurt these kids that have to play this game that we're in right now with education and these standards and tests.
Yeah.
And standards are important. I do think it is. Like we talked about, if we all just taught what we loved, if you and I loved the same things, then we'd have kids that got the same instruction and then they would miss out on huge chunks of things. So I do think standards are important to make sure that we are, giving them that holistic education that we want them to have.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. And I'll also point out too that we're talking an awful lot about assessment, and the examples we've shown you so far are multiple choice.
Right.
So we spend an awful lot of time writing multiple choice questions. This is my life. Most of the time is writing multiple choice questions, and I think we write really good ones. But any of us at STEM Scopes would tell you that we don't think they're the best way to assess students. We would definitely encourage teachers to look into other forms of assessment.
Absolutely. Like for this particular example we just looked at, that would have been a perfect way to actually have maybe a performance-based assessment where the kids actually did that and you watched them do that and you gave them feedback that way, instead of trying to take an experience and do it with a multiple choice test. It is really hard to do.
Yeah, totally. And the data that you would get from that kind of learning experience would be so much more powerful than anything you could get from a multiple choice test.
You get so much insight into the way that kids think and where they're not making the connections where they should. So much better.
Yeah. And so, okay, now I'm thinking about something else. I'm thinking about the 6th and 7th grade teachers doing their own thing.
Oh, absolutely.
And then forgetting that their content might be assessed on a later standardized test.
Yeah, I think you're getting into another one of those confessions that we might have to start talking about and making, is that when you are content planning, the team is so important, and not just grade level team, but kind of that department team, or even across campuses and schools. But those teams of teachers you work with are super important, because it does. In Texas, you do have 6th and 7th grade standards, 3rd and 4th grade standards, even some 7th grade standards that are assessed in later grade levels. So if you don't have that open communication, things could get missed, and all of that stress and work shouldn't lie on the tested grade level teachers.
Yeah, so in that example, the 6th and 7th grade teachers need to be planning with the end in mind, being not just their local assessments, but
right.
also what's going to happen to those students in 8th grade or in biology when they have to take another big standardized test, and that content could appear there later as well.
Absolutely. There were many times that we were looking at data from those 5th and 8th grade tests, and some of the lowest performing standards that the kids had struggled with were actually not even taught in 8th grade at all. They were taught in 6th and 7th or 3rd and 4th. But it's not often, they forgot the content, or we just didn't even know what experiences those other grade level teachers had given them. So it was kind of hard for the tested grade level teachers to know what to do at that point.
Right. So speaking of planning,
Yes.
I thought of something else that I think is important, and that is that when I was planning, I did a lot of thinking about what the students were going to do. And then when I would write my lesson plans, I would just make a little abbreviated version of it. They're going to do the foil lab activity. Boom. And then that would be done. And what I should have been doing, and I wish I should have been doing, is I should have also planned out what I was going to be doing.
Absolutely.
What is my role in all of this?
And that's so hard for me. That would probably, I will confess right now that if I went back to the classroom, I'm not so sure that I would still be able to do that. I'm an in the moment kind of person, so that was really hard for me, but I did see the importance of it whenever I started coaching teachers, and to be able to explain to them kind of what I did naturally in a classroom and know like when were those key times were to ask an important question and a key question. And I'm not going to say I even did it every period. I would probably have a couple periods of the day I was right on and would do what I wanted to do, and then I would forget things and move on. So it is really, really important, but that would be something I'd have to really make myself work on.
There's so many other things that a teacher's responsible for during the school day, and I think that ends up being sort of the catch-all time for this is when I'm going to put those last few grades in the grade book, or this is when I'm going to email back that parent.
Absolutely.
Or I'm going to fill out a form that I need to fill out for a meeting I'm supposed to attend this afternoon. So it ends up being teacher time to themselves if you're not very deliberate in what you should be doing otherwise. And I also think this speaks to maybe a misconception about what it means to be the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side.
Yes.
I think I underestimated my role as guide on the side. And I thought, okay, y'all are supposed to just go and do your thing now. And I didn't think about what should I be asking them? How should I be standing? Should I be going from group to group, or should I let them come to me? Just all these things that I really should have planned out in advance so that when it actually got there, I was okay to get done what I needed to get done.
And I do think that's another pitfall people fall into it's almost harder to plan for that. It's a lot easier to plan a lesson where I'm up there, me pretty much driving instruction for 50 minutes. It's controlled, it's easy, I know exactly what I'm going to do, I know what's going to happen. But to plan for all of those little nuances of things that you can't predict whenever you are pretty much the guide on the side, the facilitator, that is hard. And that's something that comes with experience, which is another reason you've got to use your team. You've got to use those teachers you teach with, because everybody has a different experience in the classroom. And so, one teacher might have a kid that asked a really good question or made a really good point that you didn't get to experience. But as y'all talk about that together, you can, for future years, figure out what you're going to do with that and how you're going to do that. But having those questions planned out ahead of time, question prompts that as you're going from group to group, what kind of things you want to ask them, and they're guiding questions that you're asking them, kind of, little formative assessments. Those were my favorite ways to get data from kids, was putting them in groups and just going and talking.
Yeah, and you said earlier too that's how you find out what they know.
Oh, absolutely.
Where they're going wrong, what misconceptions they're bringing to the table. You can find out so much about the cognition of students just by standing there and watching them work.
Yeah, and listening to them talk to each other. And I think that is, one of my favorite PD sessions that y'all have done are the 7 Deadly Sins of Teaching. And that's one of those ones where it's so hard for us to stand back and just ask those kind of probing questions of, well, why'd you say that? And or you just said that these two things are related this way. Why do you think that? To kind of get them to pull out how they're thinking. But it's so important, because that's where you can really make some headway with kids, is once you realize what connections are happening or not happening, to kind of guide them in the right direction.
It's just more data to inform your instruction. Rather than waiting at the end of instruction to collect a bunch of data, if you're standing there with them and revealing all of that, then that helps you as a teacher know what steps to take next.
So speaking of that, that's one of my confessions with planning out well, is because I didn't plan out all of that so much. I was that teacher that the kid could get me pretty off topic, especially if it was something really cool that they talked about. So I would spend time, for the most part, going group to group, but not going to lie, there probably were some times I was pretty heavily focused on one group that had gone off on some tangent somewhere where they shouldn't have gone.
I can understand that coming out of you. Yeah,
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
seems like something very Amanda-ish. But, it's like we don't do it out of, like you said earlier, we're not doing it because we're trying to steer kids in the wrong direction. We're doing it because we are passionate about this and we love sharing that with our students. So it comes from a good place. It just needs to be refined.
It certainly does. And that's one of the, and I think I talked about this in our last confession that I would have done better on, is when those kids did go on those far, go off on a tangent, is maybe having that inquiry wall, maybe thinking out like find out Fridays, like once a month, having a time where we could go off standard and we could answer some of those questions they had, or that's where I could pull in a really cool current event article I found, or that's where I could have taught my kids about gram staining bacteria, because no lie, I did that my first year teaching too. But because you've got to have that in there. I think it's really important for kids to see you being passionate and that you do love this stuff. And it's not always just about the standards, but you've got to know that's our ultimate goal, is to get them where we or the state or whoever has decided they should be.
They should be, exactly. So, when we're talking about planning with a group of teachers, one of the things I found very difficult, especially in my early years or my first years at a new campus, was that it was hard to come to a consensus about what the whole team was going to do. And so I remember leaving a time or two from a planning meeting and just saying, I'm going to do my own thing, because it was impossible to get all of us on the same page. As a matter of fact, I think I called you one time when you were my instructional coach on a Friday afternoon and said, I don't know what I'm doing on Monday.
Because we didn't
get there,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that has happened to everybody. That's why it's really important, I think, if you ever find a good team, one of my pieces of advice I would always give my teachers when they were thinking about, I think I might want to go teach a different grade level. My first question was always, do you have a good team? Because you don't leave a good team. I did once. I had a good team that I went to, but we just didn't work the way that we did before. So that was hard. But it is, I think, important to look at the fact that we are different. We have different personalities. Those different personalities bring different things to the table. And for us to take some time as a team to talk about that and how we work together and what strengths does everybody bring to the table of the group.
Yeah. One thing that stands out in my mind is that when I interviewed for that position at KMS, Amanda was the instructional coach at the time, and she asked me several questions, and then she said, okay, so in a group setting, what role do you think you take on? Nobody had ever asked me that question before, so I had never had to be introspective about what I do in a group. And so I thought about it for a second, and then I went ahead and answered her, and she was like, oh my gosh, that's exactly what we need. So it worked out to both of our advantage to know what you bring to the table and then what you need at the table,
Right, absolutely. So when I hired teachers, that was really important to me. I had good teachers, I had good group of teachers I worked with, and we were pretty open and honest about our strengths and weaknesses. And so I knew for that role that you filled is that I needed someone to be able to take these really big, out there, crazy, creative ideas and get them on a piece of paper so that they actually would get done, because we had a tendency of just talking about all these cool things that could happen, but not ever actually getting them finished.
Yeah. And, see, now that I know about myself, that I am that person, that's almost like I assume that responsibility when I go into a group setting. I know that I'm the person now that needs to synthesize all of this stuff and try to make it executable.
Right, absolutely. So one of the good things to do about working in a team, there's lots of different personality tests out there. One of them that I like is the color test, where people have different traits. My absolute favorite, maybe because it's just so spot on for me, are Myers-Briggs personality test. It gives you an inventory of different personal skills. It talks about, how do you get your energy? Are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? How do you respond to the world around you? Do you sense things? Are you intuitive? Are you a thinker or a judger? But it's a pretty broad range of categories that it looks at, that it kind of judges people off of. And there's no perfect trait for that. I think it's really important for everyone to notice that, is that there's no perfect person out there, and the world will be very boring. I used to tell my middle schoolers this all the time, if everyone was like you. So you need that, and you need some nuances in that group to balance everybody out and bring different things to the table.
Yeah.
But that's my favorite. You want to show our results? Yes.
So we have our results for you to look at. We took the Myers-Briggs the other day, and maybe you picked up on this, maybe you haven't, but we've been working together now for
long time.
like 6 years.
Yeah.
So I mean, I know in the grand scheme of things that's not that long, but we've been together a very long time, so we balance each other out nicely, and now we have proof of that. So we both did this on Friday afternoon, and we were not surprised at all to find out that we have some similarities and then some differences. So Amanda is definitely more of the extrovert in this situation, where I'm more of an introvert. We both favor intuition over sensing and feeling over thinking. And then perhaps the thing that's most important in our work together now is that I'm more of a judging personality. And
it does not mean judgmental.
It does not mean judgmental, contrary to what my husband had to say about this. And then perceiving. So you want to explain the difference between judging and perceiving?
So judging really has to do with being able to make decisions. So being able to make a judgment call, get things done, and Whitney's very good at that, whereas I'm not. That's probably my biggest downfall. And I mean, I know it, I own it. We're way far into my lifetime to know that it's going to drastically change. So I've learned to surround myself with people that will help me make that call. I like to live in the world where it's kind of open. I like to leave things open. I don't want to say we're going to do it this way because, I mean, in 3 months we might learn something new and we want to change it. So I do need people to say, because she used to do this to me all the time. I would just talk and I want this, and she'd go, okay, but stop. What's it look like right now? What are we going to do? What's step one? I'm like, okay. So I get it down. So it is nice to know how everybody fits in with the group. I think it really helps you as teachers and planning and as you move forward. And it helps you be a little bit more sensitive and understanding about other people.
About other people, absolutely.
So on another note, we've talked about, how good a team can be and how useful that can be. But another thing that I don't know if I could actually confess this, but I've seen it happen and I've had lots of teachers confess it to me, is not using your team at all. So, or even coming up with something that you're really proud of and then not sharing it. Like, because you want to own it and you don't want anyone to know about it.
I think I would have been more guilty of that, of not sharing, only because I'm pretty competitive.
Yeah, true.
And if I came up with something that was amazing and I felt like it was going to make my kids all be rock stars, then I would definitely have been tempted and might have even followed through with keeping it to myself. As a matter of fact, the teacher got very upset with me one time because I had done something really cool and my kids were talking about it to the other kids, and the other kids were like, why didn't we get to do that? She was like, why didn't you tell me? And I said, oh, I didn't think about it. But the truth is, I was thinking that maybe my kids would have just a little bit better experience and maybe they would score a little bit better. And so, yeah, it was pretty bad.
And that is, and I think that competitive nature is a good thing. But what you've got to start thinking about, and I think what as a coach, I tried to get us to that point, is that it's not about classroom to classroom. I mean, because you were with me and we were competitive, but it was about us as a department. Like, we're going to be the best department. So you better share so that all of these kids can have this experience, so that we can give those kids the best experience that they can have out there. Yeah. I don't know if I ever really held on to things. I think I might have been on the flip side. I think I probably overshared. Still for competitive, because I think that's how I thought people would know that I was really good. If I could share all of the stuff that I had created, that people would be like, oh yeah, she creates really cool stuff.
Well, I think it's funny because we have talked about this, and I've been known to say this since leaving the classroom. I've been known to say this quite a bit more, and that is, what's good for kids is good for all kids. So the planning group should always have in mind that we're going to come out of here with the best idea, and it may be a little piece of your idea, and it may be a little piece of your idea, and it may take all of us to come up with something, but when we leave here, it's going to be the very best.
Yep, best thing for kids, and all kids should have that equal experience. That's very true. So the other thing that I would sometimes do is think that I had to teach everything for that concept that we were teaching. Like, that it was my job to scaffold up, so I would teach all the way from the beginning of that concept, and then I would be like, oh, and then I have these kids that are ready to go further, so then I would take them further, and I'd end up probably covering like 3 or 4 grade levels worth of standards, just because I was trying to make sure I gave them everything they needed.
So kind of like when biology teachers spend a week on producers, consumers, and decomposers.
That they've had since like 3rd grade. Absolutely. Yeah. Just like that.
Yeah. So, I feel like that also comes from a place of earnestness. It's not that I feel like I have so much to share and I'm going to teach it better than those other teachers. It was just that I needed to control that. I needed to make sure I had controlled all of that and that all of the pieces of the puzzle were there.
Absolutely. So if we look at those curriculum maps again,
Okay.
we can see again how important it is that you kind of look vertically and that you realize where the kids have come from and where they're going. So, and again, this is something that I tried at a district level to do for my teachers so that they didn't have to do all that research for them. But yeah, so you look and say, okay, they had this, prior to me. So maybe that's my pre-assessment. That's my accessing their prior knowledge, see what they remember about that, what they learned about that. And then I see where they're going. I would like to tell my kids, and this is what's going to happen in biology. I got better about actually teaching it, but I did want to kind of show them that this is going to carry on and you are going to have to come back to it before.
Yeah, I think that's such good advice. Just know where they've been, know where they're going, and depend on those other teachers to take care of their business the way you're taking care of your business. If everybody does that, then there's absolutely not a problem in the world. Meeting with those other teachers once or twice a year might be a good idea. Go down to the elementary school and talk to those teachers and say, I really want to see what y'all are doing because I'm curious and I want to know what experiences have these kids had. Or go up to the biology teachers and show them, say, look, this is what we did in 7th grade science. They're coming to you with all of this,
That reminds me of when we started implementing interactive notebooks, which was probably one of my favorite things that we ever implemented, is that you had the kids, they had 2 per year, 1 each semester, and we kept them. Like we would collect them up. Some kids were crazy and wanted to keep theirs. But for the most part, we kept their interactive notebooks and they would kind of follow them from year to year. And that was such a good idea. Even if you don't collect all of the kids, collecting samples so that I as a 7th grade teacher could see what was done in 6th grade. Because kids have a hard time, we never learned that. But when you actually say, oh no, wait, do you remember whenever you did this lab or y'all went outside and looked at this? Then they're like, oh yeah, we did that.
Yeah.
So that was a really good idea. And we actually used them when they would get ready for their state assessment. We'd actually pull them back out when they were reviewing so that they could go back and see all the stuff that they had learned. And you could even pass those up to high school teachers as well.
Absolutely. I think that was so fun. That was new for me when I came to KMS, had not previously done that. And really the kids took a lot of pride in them. And so that made it all the more exciting for us to get to hold on to them for them. But, I was just thinking that nowadays, how easy would it be for a kid to keep a digital portfolio?
Oh, yeah.
Or even just journal online, have them do a Google Doc and just do a 5-minute journal entry once a week about what they've been learning. And they can pull that up now when they get into biology. They can go back to that document and they can search for everything they learned about mitosis. And, that way they themselves have some responsibility in keeping up with it. And it doesn't just vanish from year to year.
That is a really good idea. And that's all they do now anyway is things on the social networking and
it's like social networking for school.
Yeah.
So we really do have so many great memories of teaching. I get into these conversations with you and I'm just like sad in a way that this is not our day-to-day life anymore, but we hope that some of the things that we did will kind of inspire other teachers and let us come visit your classrooms because we miss the kids too.
Yeah, we definitely miss the kids. And I think I miss the planning. I miss what we've been talking about today is that content planning. It's almost like a little bit of a mystery. You've got to, what's the best way to do this and changing things up. I know I drove some of the teachers I taught with crazy because I would never do the same thing year after year. I'd always say, no, let's do something different. Let's make it different. But I was always striving to find that perfect lesson and actually get that standard covered the best way. And I miss that. I miss that kind of chase, the planning of all of it.
Yeah, that was exciting. So, as a community of teachers in a campus level and a district level or at a state level, no matter what, we all have experiences that we would rather forget. But instead of just pushing those memories out of the way, really think about them and think about how you learned from that experience and how you could share that learning experience with others so that maybe as we grow as a profession, fewer and fewer of us are making those same mistakes, the ones that we've talked about today.
Absolutely. And that's kind of our plan for this little series is that, to be open and honest about confessing some of those things that you've done and knowing that it's okay. And that's the whole point is to look back and, think maybe this leaf collection wasn't as cool as you thought it was, but and to want to do things different. So we thank you all for tuning in today to our STEM Talk, and we will be coming back with some more confessions on different topics in the future. So we want to make sure that you tune in for all of our upcoming STEM Talks.
And just wanted to say a special shout out for all of the teachers that helped us along the way and mentored us and guided us and made us into the people we are today. And for those that are still putting up with us,
that were part of all of these confessions.
Exactly. All right.
Bye.
Bye.